Chapter 16, Part 2. Evolution, Bias and Worldviews. Retrospective extrapolation. Without human bias, two worldview groups could theoretically coexist with equal rights to influence social institutions. Regardless of their specialization, any scientist would acknowledge that interpretations of historical data shaped by the axiomatic acceptance of modern physical principles have minimal impact on scientific progress or practical applications. For instance, a believer might argue that the rate of isotope decay was different in the past, yet still accept the relative stability observed over the past century. This shared understanding facilitates practical applications, such as oil exploration, where methodologies align across worldviews regardless of differing interpretations of how oil formed. This alignment is unlikely to hinder experiments on biogenesis, although a shift in worldview could potentially lead scientists to focus on practical applications, such as DNA recombination and cloning. These methods are already yielding concrete benefits, such as the development of new antibiotics, biofuels, and other valuable products. In contrast, attempts to recreate life from scratch, while seeking similar ends, demand significant funding and time. For 50 years, scientists have competed for what they see as the greatest discovery in biology. Yet even if they succeed, it is widely understood that recreating microorganisms from nothing would be far more expensive and unpredictable compared to the recombination of existing ones, proven by evolution to be viable. Working with established genetic structures has demonstrated its effectiveness and economic feasibility. DNA recombination allows targeted modifications to organisms to yield desired properties, drastically speeding up and lowering the costs of biogenesis-related goals. Genetic engineering and biotechnology are already producing tangible results, addressing real-world challenges. Research into biogenesis, on the other hand, primarily satisfies our curiosity rather than seeking definitive answers. For many, the origin of life through biogenesis from inanimate matter is accepted as a fact. The true drive behind this research lies in eliminating any doubts that might challenge the dominance of a given worldview, expanding its adherence, ensuring group stability, and maintaining psychological peace by avoiding the stress of rejection. Progress rests on widely accepted physical data, rendering one's worldview largely irrelevant in practical terms. The pursuit of arguments for or against a worldview, however, stems from a social instinct deeply rooted in humanity's evolutionary need to create, mask, or reinforce illusions and impressions. It is, of course, possible to transcend these instinctive biases, regardless of whether one identifies as a theist, atheist, or agnostic. Achieving this requires recalling the internal indicators of truth discussed in the chapter on free will. However, it is a mistake to assume that being a scientist or holding an academic title guarantees impartial interpretations of physical reality. This is akin to seeing a snake in every stick. Our primary instinct is to avoid the danger of social rejection. We frequently hear about the moral difficulties of leaving a religious community with its disapproval, condemnation, or even ostracism from familiar social circles, a regrettable reality. Yet, it is equally important to consider the dominance of the secular worldview in global society, particularly in education, social norms, politics, and consequently mass media. This dominance exerts its own form of alienation. Stepping outside the secular framework inevitably leaves a psychological mark. Despite declarations of inclusivity, religious individuals are subtly reminded that their beliefs amount to little more than cognitive indulgence, unworthy of equal footing with secular perspectives. While there is a condescending tolerance for the idea of a creator, yet it is not considered worthy of equal socio-legal influence across institutional spheres. There is no question of worldview democracy. At the most fundamental level of human nature, a struggle for dominance is inevitable. Civilization may have refined the methods of ostracism and social rejection, but the underlying mechanisms persist. Physical elimination and expulsion for dissent have been replaced by subtler tactics. Dissenters are portrayed as lacking intellectual or cultural legitimacy, their arguments dismissed, and their influence marginalized. Dissent is often caricatured to reinforce the dominant narrative's validity. This is not unique to the prevailing group, but is a universal trait among all worldview factions. Our worldview issues strike at the heart of human identity. The smaller the group, the stricter its rules for member retention. No one willingly isolates themselves in their worldview, which is why leaving a secular community is often less psychologically traumatic than departing from smaller, tightly knit religious groups. The smaller the group, the greater the pain of leaving. If the secular worldview were ever to become a minority sect, leaving it might resemble escaping a tightly bonded gang, a dynamic Dostoevsky vividly depicted in Demons, exploring the early atheist circles in a religious empire. One's intellectual capacity does not diminish the instinctive bias toward aligning with a community's worldview. Even those who understand the mechanics of the brain and the roots of cognitive bias are unlikely to position themselves as outcasts, thereby subjecting themselves to the maximum possible psychological harm, especially when no comparable alternative community exists. For this reason, the brain relegates responsibility for existential choices to unconscious reflexes. As a result, any analysis of alternatives that deviate from the dominant views of the group is met with an emotional response and a feeling of inner resistance. Thomas Gilovich, in his study of cognitive biases, aptly observed, "For desired conclusions, we ask ourselves, 'Can I believe this?' While for undesirable conclusions, we ask ourselves, 'Must I believe this?'" This insight encapsulates how biases are reinforced through a worldview lens. For instance, many hold the belief that religiosity was the primary cause of ignorance, violence, and the various charms of the Middle Ages. In reality, these traits are rooted in how human brains operate in specific contexts. Ideologies of any kind are merely convenient vehicles through which we pursue our aims. It is not difficult to imagine a counterfactual history in which the Middle Ages were atheist. In such a scenario, people might still possess a limited understanding of natural processes and lack the resources for a sudden technological or economic leap. Even if ignorance were identified as an obstacle to progress, competition for resources would likely still lead to violence. Certainly, we would not burn witches on charges of witchcraft, but we would burn even more on charges of charlatanism and undermining democratic initiatives. We would impose ideas of progress and a bright future with sword and gunpowder, calling it self-defense against barbarism, terrorism, and oppressive dictators. What we observed in the Renaissance era was that, in percentage terms, even more people died for the ideas of enlightenment than for competing ideologies. A similar dynamic unfolded in the Soviet Union. It is tempting to dismiss Soviet atheists as inconsistent because they failed to adhere to humanistic values, but such judgments overlook the constraints of their era. The predecessors of modern humanism lived in a vastly different social environment, one shaped by limited resources and information. Stalin, for instance, operated during a time of radical change, employing methods that combined violence with the substitution of religious practices. Similarly, Hitler, whether we like to admit it or not, was no less an atheist than Rousseau or Voltaire. The critical difference lay in his skill as a politician, adept at manipulating all social groups within his empire, where religiosity still dominated. Hitler also manipulated national pride by cultivating a sense of uniqueness and chosenness, borrowing attributes from Rome and the Vikings. He publicly aligned himself with these manipulations, giving his speeches and writings an occult religious tone within a seemingly purely atheistic framework of intraspecific struggle and survival of the fittest. Humanism per se, rooted in the intrinsic value of human life, is ultimately a fusion of economic forces and ideological principles. It thrives in environments that enhance the perceived worth of human existence only when individuals are secure from threats to their sense of self-worth or dominance. Humanism thrives only when the valuation of human existence aligns with conditions that do not threaten self-esteem or group dominance. Its fragility and rapid dissolution become glaringly evident during war or existential crises. Even the mere anticipation of such threats can dramatically shift our regard for human life and the suffering of those deemed other. Rare exceptions exist in the form of religious individuals who, irrespective of their era or context, have refused to reciprocate violence. Their ideology, though seemingly doomed to extinction, paradoxically infected their executioners, instilling a radical, self-sacrificial love for enemies. This ethos served as a prototype for humanism, which, while far from fully realized, remains an aspirational ideal. Viewed in this light, efforts to eradicate religion seem premature in the quest to create an ideal society, a theme explored further in the book Graduational Pacifism. Control experiment. In this section, we will conduct a thought experiment to delve into the depths of our inherent biases. Imagine that the academic system for training and certifying scientists undergoes a radical reform. This leads to a stark shift in the balance of worldviews. Instead of the current 86% secular majority, only 14% of scientists now hold secular perspectives, while their remaining 86% adopt a creationist view. These scientists begin conducting peer reviews, not merely to verify facts, but to reinterpret data through a new lens of understanding. This scenario reflects the principle articulated by renowned physicist, historian, and philosopher of science Thomas Samuel Kuhn. Great scientific theories do not arise from the accumulation of new facts, but from a new way of looking at them. Let us consider how this alternate reality might present itself and the potential influence it could have on our reactions. Paleontological diversity and creationism. The observed paleontological diversity would be interpreted as evidence supporting the creationist hypothesis. It would be framed as a manifestation of the inherent diversity within creation itself. The argument might proceed as follows: an infinite number of possible combinations of forms and structures naturally leads to a continuous spectrum, with inevitable overlaps and similarities among different designs. For example, if tasked with creating billions of varieties of geometric shapes, overlaps and recurring patterns between designs would be unavoidable. This concept could be extended to the fossil record, where evolutionary transitions are instead viewed as extinct diversity. 2. Global flood and geological evidence. The theory of a global flood, now reinterpreted with complex scientific terminology, would serve as an explanation for the widespread distribution of marine deposits across the Earth's surface. It would challenge the conventional narrative of episodic floods, such as the Great Transgression at the end of the Permian period, approximately 250 million years ago. This event, traditionally linked to the Permian extinction, a mass die-off that eradicated roughly 80% of marine species and 75% of terrestrial life, resulted in the submersion of vast portions of the continents, including Pangaea. It also contributed to the formation of inland seas and oceanic basins that covered 40 to 45% of land masses, profoundly altering the planet's geography. The second largest land inundation in Earth's geological history, the Triassic transgression, occurred around 200 million years ago. It followed a similar pattern attributed to tectonic activity and rising sea levels, submerging approximately 30% of continental regions. Subsequent floods, which submerged between 5% and 15% of the continents, contributed to the formation of marine deposits and the fossilization of aquatic organisms worldwide. Creationists might highlight recent catastrophic events as modern analogs, demonstrating how sedimentary layers can accumulate rapidly. They could emphasize the prevalence of curved rock layers in mountain formations that lack evidence of volcanic activity, raising a key geological question. How could these varied layers deform without undergoing significant heating, which would otherwise leave traces of melting? Why did the layers not crack in the absence of such heating? Within a creationist framework, these observations might be explained by a global flood scenario where rapid sedimentation and deformation occurred while the rock was still in a pliable state. This would have prevented cracking and avoided leaving signs of intense heat. 3. Fossil layering and species distribution. Mirroring the current enthusiasm for biogenesis, the fossil record, with its distinct layers rather than a chaotic mix of species, could be illustrated through a large-scale sedimentation experiment using a container several miles long. This experiment could illustrate the segregation of species based on factors like bone density, mobility, and type of skin covering, for example, fur or feathers, which might allow carcasses to float temporarily. Most significantly, habitat preferences would play a critical role. Creationists might argue that just as humans, wolves, and monkeys do not inhabit the same living spaces today, ancient species would similarly have been spatially segregated. In the event of a sudden cataclysm, such as a mudslide, these species might be buried in separate locations, leading future scientists to erroneously infer that they lived in different eras. The stratification of their remains, separated by varying sediment types and altitudes, would contribute to this misinterpretation. Modern paleontologists acknowledge the challenges future researchers might face due to human-induced pollution and natural nuclear phenomena, such as the radioactive anomalies found in Oklo, Gabon. These factors could complicate radiocarbon dating, potentially causing misinterpretations about our civilization. In a creationist model, instances of fossils from ostensibly distinct epochs being found together, commonly explained by unique burial conditions such as peat bogs, could instead be interpreted as statistical anomalies arising from catastrophic events. These discoveries would align with the presence of mixed fossil beds containing birds, fish, amphibians, and insects, unearthed alongside fossils traditionally attributed to different geological periods. While some species exhibit external differences and size variations, the creationist perspective might view their consistent presence across nearly all sedimentary layers as evidence of their relative abundance and resilience during a global cataclysm. The presence of petrified trees cutting through several geological layers and the occasional discovery of dinosaurs in vertical positions would be presented as corroborative evidence. The absence of many modern species in ancient strata could be attributed to the microevolutionary adaptation of ancestral species to new post-cataclysm environments. This in turn would be seen as evidence of an inherent mechanism for rapid diversification, enabling species to leverage their genetic potential to restore biodiversity quickly. If V, the emphasis would shift to arguments surrounding irreducible complexity and the lack of smooth transitions between species, where only abrupt jumps between species with fully functional complex systems are evident in the fossil record. While episodic mutations might explain minor variations, they fail to account for the emergence of entirely new major taxa. Even Stephen Jay Gould, the founder of the theory of punctuated equilibrium, a central hypothesis addressing the scarcity of transitional links, acknowledged that the paleontological record largely consists of abrupt changes, raising questions about the continuity of the evolutionary process. V. The traditional explanation for the preservation of species that served as transitional forms would be questioned, such as the fish Latimeria, coelacanth. It is believed that lobe-finned fish of the Ripidistia type, such as Tiktaalik, were ancestors of terrestrial vertebrates. The first living coelacanth was discovered in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. Despite being almost identical in skeleton, it is actually a different species. This phenomenon is an example of convergent evolution, a process in which different species independently develop similar or even identical features or forms in response to similar environmental conditions. There were many such visual copies of different species and in different epochs. Less often, there are cases of evolutionary conservatism, when species are preserved in their original form as exemplified by bacteria, insects, fish, and reptiles. Species continued their population with variability and adaptation after producing other forms and varieties through mutation. Meanwhile, hominid evolution presents a different puzzle. All links to the human species, except Cro-Magnons and portions of Neanderthals that interbred with them, became extinct, unlike monkeys more distantly related to humans. Monkeys may have survived due to their arboreal habits and dense fur, whereas early hominid species lacking these traits perished in changing environments. But luckily for us, Homo sapiens succeed. Obviously, all these explanations about the confluence of circumstances will be disputed by the dominant group of scientists. Already now, scientists present different points of view and criticize various aspects of the traditional classification of Australopithecus afarensis and other transitional forms as hominids. Their opinions can range from full opposition to proposing alternative interpretations of a dead-end form of evolution where the remains of real human ancestors have not yet been found. Scientists dispute various aspects and they come to the conclusion that this is just the morphological diversity of monkey species or the pathological features of the first humans. Most of them express doubts about the bipedalism of Australopithecus afarensis as a direct ancestor of humans and hominids. Many scientists question the classification of Australopithecus afarensis as a direct human ancestor, particularly regarding its supposed bipedalism. Scholars critical of the traditional classification include Wolfgang Larsson, Jacqueline Pellegrin, Peter Schmid, Ioannis Valencianos, Fred Spoor, David B. Goon, Mathieu Henneberg, Philip Tobias, Gabriel Varela, Ron Clark, Sergio Cancino, Bernard Wood, Bruno Richard Gimbel, Richard Smith, Martin Pickford, Jerome Michaud, Owen Lovejoy, Philippe Jordi, Charles Oxnard, and others. These researchers represent diverse schools of thought within paleoanthropology and anthropology. Their work introduces important nuances into the debate over the legitimacy of classifying Australopithecus afarensis as a hominid, challenging established interpretations and sparking ongoing discussions. 6. The hypothesis of the arbitrary formation of DNA and RNA would undergo rigorous critical analysis, including experimental attempts to assemble a few links of a protein chain using an electric impulse, manipulated like tweezers, within a controlled environment assumed to resemble conditions present during biogenesis. For instance, to create an average-length protein consisting of 150 amino acids arranged in a specific sequence. The probability of random formation is estimated at approximately 1 in 10, circumflex 199.9, rendering the event virtually impossible. The reported successes in folding several links into the correct sequence using available building blocks and models would be criticized as no more remarkable than incubating eggs in an incubator, falling short of producing a conclusive result. This critique becomes even more pronounced with DNA, where protein synthesis serves as a pivotal stage necessitating both the chemical isolation and the integration of individual components. In natural conditions, it is difficult to envision a scenario where complex organic molecules could simultaneously isolate themselves from their surroundings, while integrating into stable structures essential for sustaining life. Modern living organisms possess sophisticated mechanisms to correct errors in DNA and protein synthesis. Such mechanisms were absent in the conditions of prehistoric Earth, making the likelihood of successfully creating and preserving the correct sequence of nucleotides in DNA or amino acids in proteins even more implausible. Any error in these sequences would result in dysfunctional or harmful molecules, which would quickly degrade. In Evolution, A View from the 21st Century, 2011, James Shapiro observes, "There are no detailed Darwinian accounts for the evolution of any fundamental biochemical or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." Similarly, Richard Dawkins acknowledges in The Greatest Show on Earth and in interviews, "We don't actually know for sure that life originated by a chemical process. We know that it must have done because life is not a miracle. Life has to be a materialistic process, but we don't actually know how it happened. And we don't know how it began. We have a good idea of the stages by which it developed once it had begun, but we don't know how it got started in the first place. It is still a very deep, profound mystery." In October 2021, the Origin of Life expert Lee Cronin expressed a similar sentiment on Twitter. Origin of life research is a scam. 7. Forgeries in the field of paleontology are another argument of creationists about the possible concealment of falsifications of some paleontological findings, important from the point of view of evidential force. The scandal surrounding the fake fossil known as the Archaeoraptor emerged in 1999 when this so-called transitional link was announced as a groundbreaking discovery. It was supposedly representing a creature that combined traits of both birds and dinosaurs. Eventually, it was revealed to be a falsification. The fossil was found to be an artificial construct composed of parts from several different species. This counterfeit fossil was displayed at the Museum of Natural History in the United States and featured in National Geographic magazine. After 5 months of more rigorous examination, a clear discrepancy in proportions was identified. The body and tail sections did not align in either size or shape. Anatomical differences indicated that the tail and body fragments likely came from separate species. The arrangement of feathers on the tail and body was particularly dubious. Initial reports on the discovery were limited in detail, provoking thorough analysis and questions. In addition to this case, numerous other falsifications have been attempted, involving supposedly more ancient fossilized animals and human skeletons, which were incorrectly dated to be hundreds of millions of years old. These forgeries were typically incompatible with any known hominid classifications and were quickly identified as either deliberate or accidental misplacements, causing contradictions in stratigraphic positioning and occasionally in the chemical composition of the bones. Such instances are usually exposed swiftly. However, the Glen Rose human tracks were an exception, sparking decades of debate and controversy. In the 1930s, near the Paluxy River in Texas, tracks seemingly belonging to humans were found alongside dinosaur tracks. The majority of experts dismiss these as natural erosional formations or deliberate fabrications intended to support creationist views. In response, creationists accused paleontologists, whom they often associated with atheistic biases, of falsifying evidence. The dispute escalated to the point of a physical struggle over excavation rights, with creationists ultimately failing to secure inclusion in the expert panel. It was eventually established that the human tracks were misinterpreted dinosaur footprints, altered by erosion or possibly subjected to tampering. It is more challenging to identify forgeries that do not overtly contradict paleontological evidence. A notable example is the Nebraska man, discovered in 1922 based on a single tooth. Initially, it was declared to be part of an ancient primate and presumed human ancestor. Later, it was clarified that the tooth did not belong to a primate, but to an extinct pig species. Another example is the Piltdown man, Eoanthropus dawsoni, discovered in 1912 in Piltdown, England. Its skull bones and jaw were considered the remains of the missing link between apes and humans, and remained a sensation for more than 40 years. However, the skull was later found to belong to a modern human, and the jaw to an orangutan. The jaw had been specifically modified to appear more ancient. In 1953, under pressure from religious representatives, the hoax was exposed. Hundreds of fake discoveries have been documented and debunked in paleontology and archaeology. If minor cases, as well as those that may have gone unnoticed or undisclosed, are taken into account, the total number could potentially reach thousands. Below are 10 more examples of paleontological forgeries that were initially accepted as genuine, only to be exposed as fraudulent after significant periods of time, often following substantial media coverage. 1. Harlem Archaeopteryx was discovered in 1855 in Germany, one of the early specimens initially identified as a proto-bird, Archaeopteryx. Although the specimen was genuine, paleontologists artificially added feathers and bones to enhance its similarity to a feathered dinosaur. The exposure occurred in 1984, more than 120 years after the initial discovery, when examinations suggested that some details had been fabricated. 2. Tawtry man, discovered in 1954 in Japan, was found with remains that belonged to an ancient human. However, the remains turned out to be a falsification of bones of modern humans and animals, imitating antiquity. The forgery was exposed only in 1966, 12 years after the find, when analysis revealed modern processing traces. 3. Hydrarchos, discovered in 1845 in the United States by Albert Koch, allegedly represented the skeleton of a giant sea monster approximately 35 meters in length. The remains turned out to be an artificial construction assembled from the bones of several specimens of ancient cetaceans, primarily basilosaurids. The forgery was exposed in the same year, 1845, by renowned British anatomist Richard Owen, who proved that the skeleton was a compilation of bones from different animals. 4. Castanedolo and Olmo were finds made in Italy at the end of the 19th century. They were long considered evidence of modern humans existing in the Pliocene. However, it was later proved that these were later burials. 5. Orsman was a skull fragment discovered in 1982 near Ors in Spain. It was initially considered the oldest human remains in Europe, dating back about 1.3 million years. The find caused a sensation in the scientific world and was widely covered in the media. However, after several years of excitement, careful analysis established that the fragment actually belonged to a young donkey or horse. 6. Acinonyx curtani. In 2008, an article was published in PNAS about the discovery of the oldest cheetah skull in China, dated 2.5 million years old. However, it later turned out that the skull was a falsification. Parts were glued together from bones of different animals and supplemented with plaster. In 2012, after an independent examination, the article was retracted from PNAS, but many media outlets did not correct their publications about this discovery. 7. Phania scalaris. In 1922, the Natural History Museum in London received a fly supposedly frozen in Baltic amber 38 million years ago. In 1993, scientist Andrew Ross discovered it was a skillful fake. A modern Phania scalaris fly had been placed between two real amber hemispheres. This falsification remained unnoticed for more than half of a century and, even after exposure, continued to be mentioned in scientific literature. 8. Calaveras skull. The Calaveras skull was found in 1866 in Calaveras County, California, USA. Miners discovered it in a layer of volcanic tuff at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The find became a sensation, as, according to the reported age of the layer, the skull should have belonged to an ancient human who lived millions of years ago. In 1901, several scientists concluded that the skull was likely a forgery or the result of a mistake, possibly being the skull of a modern human intentionally placed in the mine. 9. In recent decades, numerous fascinating dinosaur fossils have come from China, but some turned out to be forgeries. For example, in the 2000s, numerous cases were discovered where different fossil fragments were combined to create more unique specimens. One notable case occurred in 2012 when the skeleton of a small predatory dinosaur turned out to be a composite of parts from several different fossils. 10. Hahn-Höfer-Sand-Mann. German anthropologist Rainer Proch von Zieten was caught falsifying the age of archaeological finds, including a skull fragment that was considered an important link between modern humans and Neanderthals. Radiocarbon analysis at Oxford University showed that the age of the oldest Neanderthal was no more than 7,000 years instead of the claimed 36,000 years. Another of the professor's sensational finds, the Bischoff Spire woman, dated to 1,300 BC rather than 21,300 years ago as he had claimed, while the Paderborn Sandeman, dated to 27,400 BC, actually died a couple of hundred years ago in the 18th century. These examples illustrate how fakes can persist as legitimate discoveries for many years, but may eventually be exposed if modern materials are detected. However, the issue becomes more complex when dealing with bones of a similar age, often found at significant distances from each other, or intermixed with remains of various species. Such mixing can be attributed to different species being part of each other's food chains, including the practice of ancient humans consuming other primates. Consequently, it is unsurprising that bones of various species are frequently found together in caves. A particular challenge arises from the common practice in paleontology of assembling fragments. This process involves refining edges to remove possible growths or correcting deformations. A notable example is the case of Lucy. It is suggested that Lucy's pelvic bones were distorted by predators into a position uncharacteristic of a bipedal creature. According to the scientist responsible for cleaning and assembling the bones, the chosen alignment was the only feasible one for this species movement. Yet, this raises a question. If this alignment is so self-evident and no other configuration would allow this primate to move, why reshape the bones to fit this particular form? In reality, this is part of the reconstruction process intended to present a clear and coherent image to the public. Many paleontological finds undergo similar adjustments. 8. Geological data can also be interpreted in multiple ways, as the age of a mineral or fossil is directly influenced by the degree of contamination. The greater the contamination, the older the sample appears. This is why laboratories refrain from providing dates until they have information about the sample's origin. Laboratory protocols have become increasingly stringent, resulting in tighter restrictions on who may request such analyses. Simultaneously, explanations for data discrepancies have also evolved. New theories have emerged to account for inconsistencies in the dating of materials such as diamonds, coal, limestone, basalt, zircon, lead, and others. These theories address discrepancies by considering factors like changes in the radiation environment, the recycling of materials within the Earth's crust, the migration of elements during post-formation rock changes, and other influencing factors. Here are a couple of examples of the relative accuracy of dating methods. In several studies conducted in the 1960s to 70s, The age of volcanic ash layers in the Grand Canyon was estimated by various dating methods, all of which gave significantly different results, from 10 to 200 million years. Lava from the 1801 eruption on the Hawaiian volcano Kilauea, tested using potassium-argon dating, showed ages ranging from 160,000 to 3 million years. The eruption of the Nova Rupta volcano occurred in 1912. However, lava samples dated by the potassium-argon method showed a 5 million year age. Lava formed as a result of the 1975 eruption of the Tolbachik volcano in Kamchatka, which showed an age of up to 2.5 million years, and so on. Basalt, Hawaii, known age 39 years, radiometric age 8.5 million. Volcanic Italy, known age 36 years, radiometric age 2.4 million. Basalt, Sicily, known age 34 years, radiometric age 700,000. Obsidian, California, known age 500 years, radiometric age 12.6 million. And so forth, culminating in the instance where new volcanic rock formed during the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. By 1992, this 10-year-old rock was broken into 3 parts, and radiometric dating produced 3 vastly different results: 350, 000 years, 900,000 years, and 2.8 million years. Dating animal and organic remains is fundamentally limited, as their age indicator is determined by the C14 isotope, which has a half-life of just over 5,000 years. Deductively, it allows for identifying a maximum age of 50,000 years. Beyond this period, dating is based solely on assumptions derived from stratigraphic layers and their indexation. Various explanations for contamination through catastrophic processes would be proposed, such as large-scale radiation penetration followed by stabilization, new measured patterns, and so on. Not to mention that a simple blind spot of decay speed may be discovered under the influence of various factors and overestimated results on heat release by non-heavy isotopes in laboratory conditions. Incidentally, heavy isotopes have a significantly faster decay rate, which allows some of them to be used in industry. The idea of the young age of the Earth's surface, based on the concept of its constant renewal, akin to the renewal of skin cells, would also turn out to be an erroneous interpretation. This metaphor, which reflects a scientific hypothesis suggesting the Earth's surface is 5,000–6,000 years old due to erosion, tectonic shifts, and volcanic activity, would not withstand criticism under deeper analysis. Among similar misconceptions would be the hypothesis about the Oort cloud and the theory about the accumulation of ice layers, which supposedly represent seasonal winter and summer cycles. In such circumstances, the skeptical community might inevitably conclude that a worldview bias, one that excludes alternative perspectives due to claims of insufficient or inadequate methodology or data inconsistencies, cannot truly be objective. The methods they have developed to prevent bias and ensure rigorous critical analysis cannot be fully effective without sufficient representation of oppositional models of past events, their absence in laboratories, and most importantly, with limited access to samples, limiting them to conclusions and publications. Even with statements by the dominant group of scientists that they are neutral and allow for the possibility of life's spontaneous generation and millions of years of evolution, pointing to the presence among them of those who do not believe in God and believe that species were populated by alien beings, who in turn went through an evolutionary process, but on Earth, according to recent discoveries and exposures that have refuted the solely empirical evidence supporting an old Earth, namely the unchanged decay rate and the heat released during the process, this is physically impossible. Unsurprisingly, any doubts expressed in this context are likely to be dismissed as conspiracy theories. In such a scenario, it becomes evident that sooner or later one might lean towards alien hypotheses simply to avoid being labeled an outcast. Alternatively, one could join a group resigned to enduring continuous sarcasm from supporters of the dominant concept. Such confrontations will inevitably be accompanied by the characteristic epithets of dominance, ignorance, science deniers, obscurantists, and similar terms. It would be unrealistic to expect that believers will entirely refrain from adopting a condescending tone. The human brain operates on the same principle, We all intuitively understand that such attitudes serve as a potent tool for instilling fear in younger generations about the risk of becoming outcasts, thereby enlarging the dominant group. This dynamic underlies most of the debates you observe. There's also a requirement to produce peer-reviewed works, but in light of the earlier thought experiment, it is apparent that this is merely a subtler form of satire. The arguments outlined in the thought experiment are speculative approximations based on my limited understanding of creationist perspectives. In reality, their arguments may be far more diverse, intricate, and nuanced. To assess them accurately, one should consult primary creationist sources and engage equally with counter-arguments from proponents of evolutionary theory. The leveling style used in this presentation is a deliberate choice, intended to highlight bias and provoke a sense of indignation at the challenge posed to a dominant worldview. However, directly comparing worldview stances in terms of truth, speculation, facts, and hypotheses is inappropriate here, as the conclusions of both sides remain inherently hypothetical. Nonetheless, both perspectives maintain a consistent reliance on empirically verifiable data. Conclusion. 1. There is no reason to doubt science, including its specific branches that focus exclusively on reinforcing a particular worldview foundation. However, it cannot be dismissed that methods of deductive analysis may be influenced by worldview subjectivism. The purpose of this chapter was to illustrate how the presentation style often employed by popularizers of certain worldviews vividly reveals our species' inherent bias in the ancient struggle for dominance, as well as the fear of becoming outcasts. To prevent such an outcome, our species is often willing to take shortcuts or act opportunistically when the external observer effect, introduced at the beginning of this book, is no longer in play. 2. Contributions to progress are rooted in widely accepted physical data, largely unaffected by one's worldview. The tendency to seek arguments that support a particular perspective is a social instinct, tied to our evolutionary drive to construct illusions and impressions. 3. It is essential to recognize that fully separating the objective from the subjective in science remains an ideal, a goal worth striving for but inherently difficult to achieve. A potential solution may lie in the unconventional proposal of philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend. Science is essentially an anarchic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humane and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives. 4. To expand the interpretive mosaic in discussions about a rational conception of God, one could adopt an evolutionary view of creation with a singular gap. The lack of clarity about what might have led God to choose a path that, from a human perspective, appears neither the most humane nor the most effective. Alternatively, one might favor the creationist model supported by its classical evidence base. This perspective offers a more humane and rational depiction of creation, but remains the subject of the most intense and justified criticism. If validated, this model would not only provide humanity with the most coherent conception of God, but also exert profound psychological pressure on human consciousness by reinforcing the certainty of God's existence. For those who find such a God unsettling, this certainty would constitute a form of existential torment. For belief in an ideal God, one whose methods of creation are both rational and considerate of those who demand the right to live without God, it suffices to assume his omnipotence. This omnipotence would imply control over the physical laws he established, allowing for interventions when necessary to preserve the environment for those still undecided about belief. For instance, this could involve halting heat release during rapid isotope decay or mitigating continental shifts, perhaps through mechanisms beyond our current understanding, thereby safeguarding Earth while maintaining the key argument that allows people to live without the thought of a God they reject. To rationalize God, we need only justify the moral and logical coherence of his actions and decisions, as addressed in earlier chapters. Additionally, the data of physical reality should suggest intentional design and the uniqueness of observable phenomena, which are discernible to a degree. However, we are not compelled to limit God to the scope of physical data known to us. It suffices to rationalize his interventions or abstentions through omnipotence and defined objectives, ensuring these align with morality and logic. If we strip away all elements of omnipotence from God's interaction with reality, we effectively negate the very concept of God.